Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all Italian friends and European ones and beyond Europe. I'm very glad today to have as a special guest to our seminars a colleague and a friend, Ezekiel Emanuel, who has quite a long CV, and to many interested in the field of ethics and consent, is probably one of the most well-known experts in the field. Currently, Ezek, for the friends, is Vice Provost for Global Initiative and Levy Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's and has been for the past few years Special Advisor to the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, and that's where we met a few times in the past few years. And for quite more than a decade, he chaired the Department of Bioethics at the NIH, and also served in the so-called Obama reform as Special Advisor on Health Policy at the White House. Very recently, Zach published a very interesting paper documenting the readability of the very recent informed consent that were used to approve the wonderful, let me say, extraordinary vaccines that were of course, approved and are now in wide use globally. And it's the right moment to have a good reflection on how good they are, how they could be improved, and where we are in using consent also in emergency, and for the future, how it looks like the research in the field. I'll be co-chairing this very interesting event with Laura Palazzani, colleague and a friend. She is also deputy director, deputy of Lorenzo Davac at the National Bioethics Committee. She's an expert in consent, has been undertaking research in this area in the past few years and very active in the field. Thank you, Laura, for joining. So I'm very glad. I leave the floor to Professor Emanuel. Zach for the friends, and please be interesting and catchy as usual. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Nicola. It's quite an honor, and it has been an honor to work with you for the last few years, interrupted, unfortunately, by COVID. So if we can have the slides, I'm going to begin talking. There are really three sections to the discussion. The first is a history of informed consent. The second is really to discuss some of the limitations that we've discovered over informed consent in the last few decades as people like Laura and others have done research on it. And then I will discuss our paper and an analysis of the informed consent documents used for the vaccine trials on COVID and the problems there and some potential solutions. Next slide. So the first part of the talk is about the history of informed consent. Next slide. Now, informed consent goes very, very far back, but I will talk about, I won't talk about the whole history, but here is just one slide to show you that over 120 years ago, a researcher, an Italian researcher actually working in Latin America, Giuseppe Santarelli, he announced that he had discovered the bacillus of yellow fever, and by injecting the bacillus into patients, he produced yellow fever in 5 patients. Now, I don't want to discuss the fact that there's no bacillus for yellow fever, and he got that wrong. But this process of injecting something that he thought was produced yellow fever into 5 patients, was then something that was being discussed in the global community at that point. And Sir William Osler, the giant of medicine, he got up at a meeting and condemned Sonarelli when this was discussed. And he said, quote, "To deliberately inject a poison of known high degree of virulency into a human being, unless you obtain that man's sanction," which is another word for consent, "is not ridiculous, it's criminal." Now notice what's going on here. You have the most important physician in the entire world at that time condemning Sonarelli because Sonarelli did not get informed consent from people in doing an experiment. And he said that not getting informed consent is a criminal act. So you can see that the idea of getting informed consent goes very far back. Next slide. There was lots of efforts to obtain informed consent. Walter Reed, when he did his research on yellow fever in Cuba at the turn of the century, also had a signed document from the researchers. But there was much research, and we're not talking about German research, and we're not talking about Japanese research on prisoners, but legitimate research by academic researchers at the best place that was deemed unethical. Frequently, they failed to inform patients of the risks of a study or ask for permission. Now, Harvard professor Henry Beecher wrote a famous article in 1966, many of you may know the article, in which he documents 22 cases where he says unethical behavior in the research was taking place. Many of those cases lacked informed consent. He said the statement that consent has been obtained has little meaning unless the subject or his guardian is capable of understanding what is to be undertaken, and unless all hazards are made clear. If these are not known, this too should be stated. So he's saying you've got to not only say what the hazards or the risks are, but if you don't know them, make that clear, and that the subject has to understand what's going on. Next slide. Next slide, please. So what does required of informed consent? Well, over time, we've identified 4 elements. First, the person who's a participant has to be competent. They have to be mentally alert. Giving consent to an Alzheimer's patient doesn't make sense, or a child. Second, the researcher or some representative must disclose information to the subject to make them aware of what's going on. Third, the subject needs to understand the material. And fourth, the subject has to voluntarily agree to participate or not agree. But in some ways, current informed consent documents are failing to live up to these ideals, especially the third point about understanding or comprehension by the participant. Next slide. Now, it's important for all of us to remember that informed consent is a process. It's a discussion as well as the document. It's not just the moment you get someone to sign. That is a mistake, although we frequently make that mistake. A clear and complete informed consent document is essential in research ethics. Next slide. Now, there are multiple issues in current informed consent, especially if you look at the documents, how long they are, how readable they are, and how much participants actually understand, or that third criteria, comprehend what is going on. Next. From 1978 to 2002, almost 25 years, the length of the consent form increased roughly linearly by an average of 1.5 pages per decade. So we have documents getting longer and longer. Over these 25 years, there was no year in which the consent forms, if you look at all of them, had a mean length that was shorter than the consent forms in the previous 3 years. In other words, it's a monotonic increase in length over time. Never are we getting shorter. Next slide. A 2014 study of 112 medical oncology informed consent forms for phase 1 through 3 studies found a median length of 20 pages, which range from 8 to 28 pages. Very, very long. You can see, because the median length is 20 pages, bias towards longer, not shorter, informed consent documents. Next slide. One study examined the informed consent templates of United States medical schools and compared it to the IRB standard listed at the same school. So the question was, if you look at the template actually written by the school to give to researchers as an example and compare that to the university's own standards, they fail. So this Flesch Kincaid is a reading test in English, and it tells you how complicated the reading is based upon grade. 10.6 is between the second year of high school and the third year of high school. So the mean grade level for the sample text was a high school grade, a middle of high school, and it was recommended, however, that the level should be grade 6, roughly 11 years old. Instead, it was roughly 15 or 16 years old. Next slide. If you look at the 61 schools with specific grade level standards, only 8% met their own standards. The mean score for readability exceeded the normal standard by nearly 3 grades. And you can see here in that graphic how much they exceeded. And you can see it's heavily biased towards the higher reading levels. Next. An analysis of 217 IRB approved informed consent documents from 2013 to 2015, again, revealed a mean readability of the 10th grade. And the 10th grade in the United States is roughly 16 years old. So the vast majority of informed consent documents did not fall below the recommended grade level for reading. It was too sophisticated, too complex. Next. In 2001, my colleague from the University of Pennsylvania, Steve Jaffe, surveyed 207 cancer center clinical trial patients. So they interviewed patients. Most of the patients considered themselves to be well-informed. So if you ask them how well-informed they were participating in research, and you ask them how well-informed they were, most thought they were well-informed. But many did not recognize non-standard treatment, the potential for increased risk from participation in the study, the unproven nature of the treatment, that's why it was in research, the uncertainty of benefits, or that trials are done mainly to benefit future participants, not people who are in the trial. Next slide. So here you can see his result. So if he asked, the main reason cancer clinical trials are done is to improve the treatment of future patients, only 25% of people answered that correctly. All the treatments and procedures in my clinical trial are standard for my type of cancer. 3/4, 74% of people thought that was right. The treatment being researched in my clinical trial has been proven to be the best treatment for my type of cancer. This is research, so it couldn't be proven. 70% thought that was right. Compared with the standard treatment for my type of cancer, my clinical trial does not carry any additional risks or discomforts. 63% thought it carried no additional risks. And there may not be direct medical benefit to me from my participation in this clinical trial. Basically, 1/3 of people thought that was true. 2/3 thought there might be direct benefit to them. So you can see on these very, very core measures of adequate informed consent, cancer patients who already enrolled in the trial, who've already been through a consent process, got the vast majority of got these questions, simple questions, wrong. Next slide. 10 years later, so in 2011, a study using the exact same questionnaire found almost the exact same results. Over 50% of participants answered incorrectly on these kinds of comprehension questions. So all the treatments and procedures in my clinical trial are standard for my type of cancer. 66% of people thought that was true. The treatment being researched in my clinical trial has been proven to be beneficial. 54% of people thought that was true. And compared with standard treatment for my type of cancer, my clinical trial does not carry any additional risk. 54% of people thought that was true. Again, very, very important. Majorities of patients incorrectly answering basic questions about cancer clinical trials. Next slide. And recently, a study tested the recall. That is, you give people informed consent and then come back to find out how well they remember the details. 266 volunteers in a phase 1 clinical trial with 7 questions, awarding 1 point for each correct answer. So the mean total of score for all the volunteers was 4.5% out of 7, a little better than half. Only 7% were able to state the aims of the study in a phase 1 study correctly, that it was a dose finding and a safety study. So what we can clearly say, I think, as a result of this trial, these data, are that, 1, we have documents that are getting longer and longer and longer. 2, that the readability, the amount of education a participant needs to actually understand the document is very high compared to what it should be. 3 to 5 grades higher. In addition, that the comprehension of people who participate with these kinds of informed consent documents is quite poor, and that they do not understand the basics of trials, that they're in research because it's not with a proven therapy, that there might be additional risks to their participation, and matters like that. So we're going to pause here and before we look at the consent documents for the COVID vaccine trials for questions.
Thanks a lot, Zach, for this very, very clear introduction to this complex field. Thanks for quoting Stephen Joffe's paper 20 years ago. And I would like also to invite all attendees, that are more than 1,000, to also provide or send questions to the coordinating group. They can just send in written. And let me start with the first question on how do you judge the fact that though there were these misconceptions and people did not understand the nature of the experimental studies or the clinical trials, people, especially in the paper by Stephen Joffe, showed satisfaction with the assistance they received, meaning is however trust and the doctor-patient relationship prevailing always, as you wrote on this? What's your view?
Well, it's very hard to know. If you don't have the true answer, it's very hard to know whether you've gotten it right or wrong. And this is, I think, a basic element. You know, I'm a professor. I grade my students. If my students hand in, did you do well? They all think they did well, but they don't have the real answer. And I think you're seeing that in this. The second thing I would say is that sometimes what we think is important may not be important to patients. So a lot of cancer patients, I don't know if you mentioned that I'm an oncologist. So Steve Joffe was at the Dana-Farber.
Actually a surgeon, right?
Right.
Yeah.
It's very much that when patients come to me, they already want to be on a trial. They already have that in their mind that the trial is good for them. And so they're not so worried about what the details of an informed consent document are. And by the way, under those conditions, I think it's quite likely that people don't, it's a very long document. It's a 20-page document. I'm not going to read it. I want to be in the trial. And so they don't absorb anything. I make an analogy. I don't know how many people on the phone or on the today have signed mortgages to buy a house. When you sign, and I don't know how it is in every other country. I can tell you in America, it's a stack of papers about this big, and you're signing and signing and signing. And because it's this big, you read nothing. You sign away, you ask, how much am I going to pay? And how long is it for? And that's all you want to know. And so I think it very much is the same kind of thing. The bigger it gets, the less you read because it takes too long. And I think a large part, you get a 20-page cancer document, it's, the doctor told me the 2 or 3 things that are important to me. How often do I have to come back? Am I getting a treatment that he or she thinks is the best for me at this time? So I think that's why people feel informed. It's too complicated to get into the details because they're so long, and they already come to it wanting to be involved.
May I ask Laura if she wants to co-chair?
Thank you. I was really surprised when you said we forget it is a process. We forget it's something more than a paper to be signed, but it is a dialogue between a researcher and a participant. So do you think that maybe also the training of researchers to be not only a good researcher, but also a good communicator could improve in a certain way this trustworthy environment between researcher and participants?
There's no doubt that communication is going to be critical. But I think it's a really important empirical question, which is if you train doctors who are doing the research and getting the consent to be better communicators, is it going to improve patients' consent? And I think it's very important to be, and this merges your question with Nicola's question, which is the informed consent process and the answering of questions and the communication may be different in different kinds of studies. So in a cancer study with a very severely ill patient, they may already have made up their mind, and whatever you put in the document and discuss with them may not be that important. On the other hand, if you have a healthy person participating in, for example, a vaccine trial or a phase 1 trial, it may be a very different circumstance because there they may think, I'm not clear what the benefits are, but there are maybe serious risks. And there, the document, the specification of risks, the specification we don't know the risks, may turn out to be very, very important. And they may pay attention a little bit more. They may not have made up their mind so clearly beforehand.
Thank you, Zach. As we have questions coming from the audience, let me read you the first one that has come. Maybe Laura goes next. A difficult question for you. What are the causes for informed consent so long? Do you think it's possible to find a new balance?
Yeah. The reason I'm talking to you is because I think there's a possible to find a new balance. And I think there are multiple reasons why we've gotten longer and longer. And I think it's a vicious circle. One reason is you have research ethics committees, and they think that they need to add everything, otherwise they're not doing their job on informed consent. And then you have these data coming out and saying, well, patients really don't understand. And so the research ethics committee says, we've got to add more. That'll improve their understanding. And so I think you have this sort of negative cycle. Every time we get a study, a big important study saying they don't understand, you get this response of, let's add more information. With no evidence, I should say, emphasize, no evidence, adding more information to an informed consent document improves comprehension or understanding. So I think that's a very important element. I think the second element, certainly for trials that are done very much by drug companies. I think the lawyers get their draft the informed consent documents, or certainly review them. And I think they are reading it not for how is this going to inform a participant, but how do I protect the company? Leave aside the fact that there's almost never a research trial where the company has been liable because of what's in the document. There's never been a lawsuit to that effect. But I do think that lawyers, they just decide we're just going to add more, and then we can say we're protected. I will tell you, when you begin to read many of these documents over and over again, you see that a lot of the material is what we call in the United States boilerplate. It's standard, and it just goes into every trial, whether it applies to the trial or not, because the lawyers say, oh, you've got to have this privacy statement. But it's irrelevant to this trial because we're not doing a genetic test on the data, but it's in there anyway. And we found that in as I'll talk about in the next vaccine studies, just lots of privacy information that is irrelevant to this particular study.
Yes, may I? There's another question that's very practical. It would be reasonable to provide with a short executive summary beside the complete informed consent. And I would add also a glossary, maybe sometimes with technical words, to explain better.
So two things. First of all, you will see, I think it's possible to reduce the informed consent dramatically. Whether a one-page summary can get you enough of the detail, and then you have the document. But even that document that you include with an executive summary, I think needs to be shorter, needs to be clear. The second thing I would say is, I don't like the idea of a glossary personally. I think we should strive as much as possible for simple language. Now, sometimes it's very hard to get it down, and I will agree that in some circumstances, but I would rather define it in the text, in the actual language, than add another set of glossary terms. And one of the problems of glossaries is you will get people writing with technical jargon and say, oh, well, we'll just define it in the glossary. And that will actually make the readability of the documents worse, not better.
Another point, another question is about fragile populations. And that's why I would like you to say something about the so-called tailored consent. We always speak about tailored medicine. Can we talk about tailored consent, so tailored to age, sex, or ethnical belonging of the populations?
Well, the Research Ethics Committee that reviews an informed consent, and by the way, the researcher, when you start out, unless there's some reason you're targeting only a very particular group, you may not know who's going to sign up and take the COVID vaccine. You have no idea whether they're vulnerable or not vulnerable. So I think you end up with a standard document that should be clear to anyone, vulnerable or not. The second thing I would say is I get a little worried, and I've written about this, as you know, Laura, about the use of vulnerable. We use the word vulnerable way too much. You know, for some people, having cancer makes you vulnerable. I'm not sure under what idea. For some people, a woman is vulnerable. Again, that's just sexist. I think we use it way, way, way too much. There are very few groups that are vulnerable. And I'm not sure that a special informed consent document is the way to solve the vulnerability.
Great, Zach. I think this was the perfect start. I think we can move on so that we will have also more questions in the final part. And please, you have the floor.
All right. So if we go to slide 17, please. So what we did, at least in the United States, I've been heavily involved in the COVID situation. mostly writing about allocation of scarce resources, allocation of vaccines among countries. But I was also curious about the vaccine trials. I knew someone who was on a trial, and they said that the informed consent document was something like 28 pages, I think they said to me, and I was curious about them. So we went about collecting the informed consent documents for the 4 top trials: AstraZeneca, J&J, Johnson & Johnson, the Moderna, and the Pfizer BioNTech. Next slide. And we looked at these documents. Our key question was, how well do the informed consent documents from these vaccine trials achieve the ideal of being succinct, readable, and something that a person can understand? Next. So informed consent documents should be brief, readable, prioritize participants' understanding, and as we noted, they're getting complicated. The COVID vaccine trials, probably in the last 30 years, it was hard for me to think of another set of trials that have been more world attention focused on than these vaccine trials. And we know that collectively on the 4 big vaccine trials, more than 150,000 participants in multiple global sites, the United States and Britain, South Africa, Brazil. Next slide. So these were the ideal, if anyone should have spent some time getting them right. So again, we spent some time to collect the COVID-19 phase 3 vaccine randomized trial informed consent documents. And I can tell you, not easy to get them. The companies were not willing. It was very surprising how hard. At least in 3 cases, I had to call directly to people I knew at the company, and they had to go to the lawyers to get them to agree to give me the informed consent documents. There are others, I don't know that they were trying what I was trying, but they were interested in the documents and could not get them, and asked me if I could share them with them. So I know it was difficult for others to get these documents. Next slide. So we looked at 4 issues. First, how long were these informed consent documents in terms of words, and how long would it take a person, a normal person, to read them? Second, we looked at how complex the language was. What grade level was necessary to understand these documents? Third, we looked at a separate score, which is readability, and that actually looks at how easy it is to read the documents, whether separate from the grade level. This really depends upon the complexity of the words that are being used in the document. How many syllables are in those words, how many multi-syllable words. And the last thing we wanted to know is, before we got on, Lara was talking about placebo trials with me on the vaccines. And all of the early trials were done with a placebo. So we wanted to know, what information did they give participants about what would happen once they got the results of the trial? If they were in the placebo arm, would they get the vaccine if it was proven safe and effective? How long and how long would they go? Next. So here is the data on length and reading level. The first thing you can see is the pages, 25, 25, 2017, 21.8 was the mean number of pages. And the word count, you can see the mean number of words was over 8,000 words for these vaccine trials. The reading level was not quite 16 years old, closer to 15 years old. And then the reading ease, this is a score of 0 to 100, where the higher the score, the easier it is. Under 60 is considered very hard to read for the average person, difficult. So you can see all of the informed consent documents were difficult. The AstraZeneca particularly difficult, but really all of them fell under the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, threshold for difficulty. So they are long documents. They take, I didn't emphasize this, but they take almost 35 minutes at a normal reading pace. That's without reviewing anything or without stumbling. 35 minutes to read, 8,000 words, and they're very complex. Next. So at 240 words reading, a participant would need 35 minutes to read the document. And again, they don't account for rereading, which would add additional time if they got to some area that they thought was complex and they really wanted to understand it. 35 minutes. Now, how many people are going to sit down and read for 35 minutes about getting a vaccine trial? That I ask you. Next slide. It's recommended that informed consent documents are written at grade level 6 in the United States, and none of the 4 documents, none of them were grade level 6. They all exceeded grade level 9, so 3 additional grade levels. And all documents, as I mentioned, had a score of less than 60 on the reading ease metric, where lower is more difficult. And none of them got to what the NIH classifies as ease. Next. Only one document out of the 4, one document said anything about how the placebo group would be treated were the vaccine proven safe and effective. There was, I think, 2 sentences in the document out of 8,000 words, and it was pretty oblique, and it did not specify a timeline or any other details about where you might go, how you might be informed, etc. It was very poor, and 3 of the documents said nothing. Not the way you want an informed consent document. Next. Now, one of the challenges I set is not just to point out that there are problems with other people's documents, but to propose an alternative document. Could we rewrite these informed consent documents, taking one of them as a template, and make it better? So I sat and I had an assistant and we went back and forth. So we formulated a substitute informed consent document covering the exact same topics because we started with a template. Ours was less than 3,000 words. It had a reading time of 12 minutes, about a third as long, and a reading level under grade 8. We still didn't get to grade 6. That was very hard because of the language. Next. So here's the comparison between the mean of the others and our alternative. Ours was 10 pages compared to 21.8. Ours included a very big table. Reading time, as I mentioned, about a third. Also, just over a third the words. Reading level was 2 grades down, and the reading ease, we passed the 60 threshold, so ours was easy to read according to the NIH. Next slide. I'm going to give you some examples. In the purpose of the informed consent document, you can probably not read this, but the purpose is in all the documents begin, coronaviruses are a large family of viruses that cause illness ranging from the common cold to more severe respiratory disease, such as Middle Eastern respiratory illness. Then they say there was an outbreak of COVID-19 caused by a 2019 novel coronavirus, SAFR-CoV-2, begun in Wuhan, Hubei province, China in December 2019. On and on, 146 words, right? To tell you the purpose of the trial. We reduced that to 12. This study will test a vaccine against the virus that causes COVID-19. Boom. What Hubei province, the nature of coronaviruses has anything to do with the purpose of the trial? Irrelevant. Irrelevant, right? If you're signing up for a COVID-19 vaccine trial, the purpose is to test a new vaccine, period. I think the rest of this is researchers or lawyers talking about where the virus comes. It's not relevant. And you can see the huge difference in word length, the huge difference in readability that we were able to achieve. Next slide. Here are just 2 other examples. In risk, they say As in all research studies, the COVID-19 vaccine may involve risks that might be expected based upon the results from studies of similar vaccines, as well as risks that are currently unknown, right? The only relevant thing is this vaccine may cause currently unknown risks. That's the relevant thing. Pregnancy precautions. They go on and on about pregnancy precautions, right? 65 words. And it's simple. The study doctor will help you choose and implement an effective methods of birth control, right? 16 words versus 65. It's basically a quarter the number of words, much more readable. So it was possible to develop a shorter informed consent document that was much more readable than what the various drug companies spending lots of money were able to achieve. Next. Now, next slide. So what can we understand? The 4 informed consent documents are way too long, 21, 22 pages. They present an unreasonable amount of time for participants to read, and that may impede their comprehension. They're too difficult to read. Again, potential threat to comprehension for participants, especially those who don't have higher education. Next. And the results of this study suggest that the practice of informed consent has been compromised by lengthy and complex documents. Organizations involved in clinical trials should explore hiring an editor rather than leaving the creation of the informed consent document to researchers and legal teams without expertise in careful and, especially importantly, succinct writing. Next. So what might contribute to these long documents that are too complicated and too not easy to read? Well, ethics reviewers may not insist on shorter, more readable documents, or may even require additional material that they think will improve information transfer and comprehension. Again, almost always with no evidence that they improve anything. Informed consent documents may be created by copying sections, as I mentioned, from previous documents, just increasing. And legal teams may prioritize exhaustive detail for preventing lawsuits over participants' comprehension. Next slide. So I would suggest that what we really need, and this is mainly directed at people who are running trials, so you drug companies, I'd be love to participate, and it phase 1 and phase 2 future directions for informed consent documents. The first phase would be a randomized controlled trial to evaluate shorter, more readable documents on the time of consent, the frequency of enrollment, comprehension, and how satisfied participants are. Now, I know there have been some trials. They haven't been great, and part of the reason I think they haven't been great is they have not done a very good job of making the document shorter and more comprehensible. And as I said before, I think we should try these phase trials, some on serious patients with serious illness who are participating, like cancer or rheumatoid arthritis, and sometimes on participants where the are normal volunteers. Now, a second phase would be to randomize non-document informed consent. Don't use a document, maybe use a video or even just a discussion and see how that deals with the time of the consent, the enrollment, comprehension, and satisfaction. We don't know the answers to both those questions, I think, in any effective way. I'd love to find the answers, and I think conducting research on informed consent is critical. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the additional questions.
Thanks a lot, Zach. I think it was a wonderful presentation, quite inspiring, also on next steps. And I truly appreciated your directness. When I read the paper, I found it absolutely timely, absolutely worth a joint reflection, and here is where we are.
Thank you very much.
Let me go through one or two questions just arrived, and maybe others will be coming. As you were mentioning videos for a trial, do you think then probably technology could have a role in facilitating the understanding of the informed consent, or that's the hypothesis and you should think we should submit the hypothesis to appropriate testing?
I think videos might, but we always have intuitions about the results, but I like to think of myself as empirically driven. We should evaluate them. We shouldn't assume that they're going to be necessary because it's a video or it's technology driven, it's better. And let me just remind people, we do have some trials where patients taped the informed consent discussion. And that did not lead to an improved consent comprehension. It actually led to worse comprehension. And it may be that you rely on that video or you rely on the audio. So you're not attuned as much as you might be to, say, if you were reading a document. So I think we have to evaluate it. The intuition is maybe it will improve the informed consent and comprehension. But I think we have to be open to the possibility that for reasons we might have to learn, it compromises informed consent and does not improve it.
Laura.
Question that's very interesting about the possibility that citizens associations could participate in writing informed consent. There's a discussion on the so-called co-design and the participation engagement of the citizens. What do you think about?
I'd be a little hesitant. I think that it would be helpful to have citizens' input for what elements should be in there, but not necessarily for writing. I do think that there is a important skill in writing clear and short and readable documents. I may be different than many people listening. I actually think that most times people who edit my work, who are really competent editors, do a great job and they make the work better. And I think there's a skill at editing. And I think actually having a professional editor who knows something about science, knows something about the research study, can be very good at making these documents clearer and shorter. Editors of magazine articles, for example, part of their job is to make the article shorter and clearer. And I do think that's a skill I think we have not made the best use of.
May I ask? Oh, sorry, Laura, go.
There is a question also on children and adolescents that's very interesting. Would you use, for example, images, pictures, or cartoons or something?
So I think for young children, we don't try to get informed consent. We try to get assent, get them to understand something about the research. And yes, diagrams may be relevant, helpful. I think for adolescents, again, if we write these informed consent documents properly, generally adolescents should be able to understand them. And so I would be less inclined to use pictures. Now, they may be in the current era, technology may be better with them. Again, these are questions we don't know the answer to, and we should try our best in randomized trials.
Thanks a lot. May I ask you or ask to share some consideration on the fact I was slightly surprised that you mentioned that you tried to compress as much as you could, but you reached almost 3,000 words in your re-editing. By the way, some of the examples you showed were really nice in how better is the short phrasing. As you mentioned, one-page summary could be the target. How far or how difficult do you think would be to go there? Because one page is less than 1,000. So what was the hurdle for you that worked on this?
Well, I would say that the main hurdle in these trials was informing people about what would be necessary for them to do all the procedures that would be necessary. The blood draws, the number of times they had to visit, what was expected at each visit. As I mentioned, we had a large chart, and part of that large chart was what you would, all the things that had to do coming back 3 weeks later for another injection, the tests that they were, the blood draws that they were going to do. That turned out to be the most complex part of the informed consent document. And that's also where the readability, the grade level went up in terms of the immunological and other tests that were being taken. That was, I think, so it really depends. So when I think about some of the complex clinical chemotherapy trials that I participated in, enrolled patients in, when you're coming back every 2 weeks or 4 weeks for an extended period of time, that does make it complicated. I would say that these vaccine trials, they were written so that someone would come back for 26 months. Okay, 2 years. So that tells you it's hard to compress that too much. What you can say is you'll come back for a long time. And by the way, here's a table with the schedule and what's going to happen at each visit. But, that still requires material. In addition, at least on these, it was somewhat complicated to discuss the privacy issues because of the special nature of the trials with the federal government, and also the pregnancy issues, not getting pregnant, using birth control. Those are what added to the length here.
Very, very interesting. Let me just comment, as we all are quite passionate on this, that 25 years ago, or probably even 30, when also in Europe and in Italy, we started, or actually were started, collaborative cardiovascular trials. And I remember the GC experience coupled with the ISIS in Oxford. And I clearly remember that the first proposal in the 2 trials that were organized by Mario Negri Institute, the consent were less than a page. So the idea was you can be, there were acute one-shot treatment. And I still find those consent much more clear, much more honest, much more generating trust. Maybe after 30 years, we could be good to consider the 2 extreme, where we started and where we are now. What's your view on optimal length? As you just mentioned, difficult and tricky issues.
Well, again, I think part of the issue is how much information we think is necessary to convey. One of the advantages of an acute cardiovascular event is you're probably not doing follow-up for 26 months with visits every month. And I think that may make it a little easier. You also don't deal with the pregnancy issue at all, and you have no stored tissue issue at all. So I think all of those, make it easier. Again, I would love to see informed consent documents as short as possible. And I think I will tell you, Nicola, when we have talked with research ethics committees about doing these trials, they immediately say, well, aren't you going to give the long document to patients? So they clearly have a bias that long is better. They clearly think the standard is a very long document. On what basis? I think you have no evidence that longer is better. And so the idea that our bias is you should give them the long one, make sure that everyone gets the long one, is part of what creates long documents.
Extremely interesting. Thank you. Laura, maybe you can.
No, maybe not longer document. I completely agree with you on the short, to keep short as possible, and maybe more dialogue, more relationship between the researcher and the participant.
Yeah.
And another little question, if we may, we have time, about you mentioned global, of course, the global trials, and so in multicultural settings, do you think the cultural mediator may have a role? because it's not only a problem of translation, it's a problem of different cultural differences. What do you think? Is it possible the role of cultural mediator plays a role?
It could be important. I will say, so we've done some trials 15 years ago, I want to say, maybe a little less or more, but about 15 years ago in Africa, and looking at informed consent. And there, our main focus was on sharing genetic material, because there was this big view. Africans would not want their genetic materials shipped out of the country to the United States or Great Britain. And when we surveyed participants in Uganda, for example, that wasn't true. They were not bothered by that. They wanted to make sure, however, that they would be protected and that things would not be commercialized. So I think, again, how much the cultural communicator is going to add, it's an evaluation. We often think that somehow people can't understand, they're worried about exploitation. Didn't seem to be the main problem that we investigated. I will tell you, world over, the biggest problem is randomization. It's extremely hard for people to understand randomization. And this, almost regardless of education, you can have college educated people and explaining to them that your doctor's not going to choose, we're taking it out of an envelope or a random number, very complicated. And almost no one really understands it. And people, I think, deep down want to believe the treatment, it's going to be selected for me. Anyway.
Thanks a lot. Laura, do you want to mention some of the questions that we just come?
Yes, there is another question about refusal. So do you know about cases of people reading informed consent for vaccines against COVID-19 and then refusing to vaccine? So informed consent as a consequence of dissent, not consent.
I do not know. And the people I talked with at the companies did not actually have the data about how frequently people in the COVID-19 trials actually refuse participation. So I don't know. I do have a feeling that this is the kind of trial where you, if you got into the trial and were asked, you just signed up, because you had already mentally committed yourself to the trial, and there wasn't going to be a detail that they presented that was going to likely change your mind. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think that what we call yield, the number of people you give the informed consent to and the number of people who sign up, was going to be low. I think it was going to be extraordinarily high. But obviously, one of the things you'd like to know is how high was the yield, how satisfied were people, and how many people dropped out.
Yes, also the assessment of the motivation, because many voluntaries were strongly motivated because of solidaristic attitude. So maybe
I agree, totally agree.
That is another motivation.
And I don't know that that's a problem. I mean, is that a good justification for participating? Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
So Pleasant, you are a fast thinker rather than a fast talker. So let me go back a second on what you just said, because I think it's good to share. I truly liked and appreciated your deep honesty in saying that randomization is very difficult to understand, to accept, to normalize somehow. And the idea that you would ask your doctor what would he prefer or would he suggest to you is still so prominent, which I think is good to maybe it could be part of the consent, though you don't fully appreciate or understand the experimental nature of having two well-balanced groups. Randomization is profoundly tricky. I truly appreciate that you don't took it for granted, like that's
Yeah.
the rule. Yeah. And what to do on it, we don't know. We don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. People have tried many, many things, and I'm not sure that there's that we still have an answer to that question. I just don't. It may be one of those things that you can't explain to most people, and we'll have to, not that we'll give up randomization, but we have to give up the idea that this is going to be something people comprehend. It may be something they have to take on trust from the researchers and not comprehend.
But actually, in the first trial, the famous tuberculosis streptomycin trial,
Yeah.
Bradford Hill found that the limited amount of drug available, actually the scarcity, was an absolutely facilitating factor to explain people why we randomize. And that's
Right.
not the case most of the time. So
Exactly.
yeah. So thanks deeply for your inspiring studies, for your inspiring presence, and for your openness. I truly, every time I have the opportunity to meet you, to listen to you, I truly feel reassured that also what we just discussed. I think the openness, I don't like the word transparency, means so many things, but the idea of sharing, of being part of a global community, of being ready to test what we do and what we hypothesize as potentially beneficial is so important. And surely your work for 2 decades was there, but every time you recommend also on global issue is very reassuring. So that's my thank.
Well, thank you, Nicola, and thank you for providing this opportunity. But I do think this is an area where we haven't had enough research, and where the hesitation to do research on what can improve the informed consent process has been too big. We're only going to make it better by trying new things.
So maybe let me close with a smile from an editor at the BMJ. Richard Smith used to say, "Sorry, I didn't have much time. I wrote it long." So, and maybe is what you just said, that the shorter, the better, but it's not easy.
Yeah,
so
takes time.
I hope we can invite you soon in Rome after the summer to have you in presence and for future exchanges. Thanks a lot for accepting with such a short notice. And
well, thank you, and look forward to seeing you and your colleagues in Rome, and you too, Laura.
okay.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you for
Laura.
inviting me. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.